The giant stallion stood his ground as fire consumed the ridge, his 2,000-pound body the only barrier between 20 helpless foals and certain death. When veterinarians examined Goliath after the rescue, they found something that explained his impossible courage and left the hardened rancher weeping. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The smoke arrived before anyone expected it. One moment the Montana sky was clear and blue, stretching endlessly over the Thompson Valley Ranch, and the next it was choked with ash and the acrid smell of burning pine. Jack Thompson had been ranching these lands for 43 years, had weathered droughts and blizzards, economic crashes and personal tragedies, but he had never seen a wildfire move this fast. The radio crackled with emergency warnings as he stood on his porch that August morning, watching the horizon turn from gold to gray to an ominous orange that made his chest tighten with fear. The wind had changed overnight. What the Forest Service had assured them was a controlled burn miles away in the National Forest had suddenly jumped the firebreak, fed by unexpected gusts that pushed it across dry grasslands and through dead timber like a hungry beast. Jack could see it now, a wall of flames dancing along the ridgeline to the east, moving faster than anything natural should move. He had maybe 2 hours, maybe less, to evacuate his horses before the fire reached his property. His hands shook as he grabbed his truck keys and his old leather work gloves, his mind already calculating what could be saved and what would have to be left behind. The main barn held 12 horses, all of them registered quarter horses that represented years of careful breeding and training. They were already spooked, their high-pitched whinnies cutting through the thickening smoke as Jack threw open the barn doors. His ranch hands, Miguel and Tommy, were already there, moving with practiced efficiency to halter the panicked animals and load them into the 3 trailers they had ready. The horses trusted them, mostly, but fear was contagious, and the smell of smoke made even the calmest animals dangerous. Jack's favorite mare, a sweet-tempered bay named Copper, nearly trampled him in her rush to escape the barn, her eyes rolling white with terror. But it was not the horses in the main barn that worried Jack the most. His mind kept returning to the far pasture, the one that backed up against the creek where he had moved his prized Percheron stallion Goliath 3 weeks ago. Goliath was not just any horse. At 19 hands high and weighing close to 2,000 pounds, he was a gentle giant who had won every draft horse competition from Wyoming to Washington. More than that, though, Goliath had a temperament that made him invaluable for Jack's breeding program. The stallion was patient, intelligent, and had a way with young horses that Jack had never seen in any other animal. 3 weeks ago, Jack had made a decision that now filled him with dread. He had moved Goliath to the far pasture to oversee 20 of his newest foals, all of them born that spring and summer. It was something Jack did every year with his most trusted stallion, allowing the young horses to learn from a calm, steady presence. The foals ranged from 3 to 6 months old, a mix of quarter horses, paints, and crosses that represented the future of his ranch. They were worth a fortune, yes, but more than that, they were living beings he had helped bring into the world, had watched take their first wobbly steps, had bottle-fed when their mothers could not. The far pasture was accessible by a dirt road that wound through a narrow canyon, but Jack knew with sick certainty that the road would already be cut off by now. The fire was coming from the east, and the canyon funneled straight into its path. His only hope was that Goliath would have the sense to lead the foals to the creek, where the water might offer some protection from the flames. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a desperate hope. The creek was shallow this time of year, barely more than a trickle after the dry summer, and the foals were too young to understand the danger they were in. Miguel appeared at his side, his face streaked with sweat and ash. The main barn was nearly empty now, the last few horses being loaded into the final trailer. They had maybe 20 minutes before they needed to leave, before the fire would be close enough that staying meant death. Jack looked at his ranch hand, this man who had worked beside him for 15 years, who had a wife and 2 small children waiting for him in town, and he saw his own fear reflected back at him. Jack made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, though he did not know it yet. He told Miguel to take the loaded trailers and head to the evacuation point at the county fairgrounds. He told Tommy to go with him to make sure every horse made it safely. And then, against every bit of common sense and survival instinct he possessed, Jack climbed into his truck and headed toward the far pasture, toward Goliath and the 20 foals he had left there, toward a wall of fire that was consuming everything in its path. The dirt road was already hazy with smoke, and Jack had to turn on his headlights, even though it was barely 9 in the morning. His truck bounced over ruts and rocks as he pushed the accelerator harder than he should have, knowing that every second counted. The radio had gone to static, and all he could hear was the roar of his engine and the pounding of his own heart. He prayed silently, fervently, making bargains with God and fate and anything else that might be listening. He had lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago, had buried his father and mother on this land, had said goodbye to too many things he loved. He could not lose Goliath. He could not abandon those foals to burn. The canyon walls rose up on either side of Jack as he pushed deeper into the valley, and the smoke grew thicker with every passing minute. He could taste it now, acrid and bitter on his tongue, and his eyes watered until he could barely see the road ahead. The temperature inside the truck was rising despite the air conditioning running full blast, and Jack realized with growing horror that the fire was closer than he had thought. Through breaks in the smoke, he could see embers floating through the air like deadly fireflies, landing on dry grass and sparking new flames that spread with terrifying speed. His mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Even if he reached the far pasture, how would he get Goliath and 20 foals out? The trailers were gone, already on their way to safety with the other horses. He could not lead them back through the canyon, not with the fire already cutting off that route. The only other way out was over the ridge to the north, a steep and rocky trail that even experienced horses would struggle with, let alone frightened foals who had never been off the ranch. But he had to try. He had to at least give them a chance. The truck rounded the final bend, and Jack saw the far pasture spread out before him. The sight that met his eyes made him slam on the brakes so hard that the truck skidded in the dirt, coming to rest at an angle across the narrow road. There, in the middle of the pasture, stood Goliath. The massive Percheron was facing the approaching fire, his enormous body planted firmly in the ground like an ancient oak tree. Around him, pressed close to his legs and flanks, were all 20 foals. They huddled together in a tight cluster, their small bodies trembling with fear, but none of them had scattered. None of them had panicked and run. Goliath had gathered them all, had kept them together, and now he stood between them and the wall of flames that was advancing across the ridge. Jack jumped out of the truck, his boots hitting the ground hard as he ran toward them. The heat was intense now, a physical force that pressed against his skin and made it hard to breathe. The smoke was so thick that he could barely see 20 feet ahead, but he kept running, calling out to Goliath in a voice made hoarse by ash and fear. The stallion turned his massive head at the sound of Jack's voice, and even through the smoke, Jack could see the intelligence in those dark eyes. Goliath knew exactly what was happening. He understood the danger, understood that the fire was coming, and yet he had not abandoned the foals. When Jack reached them, gasping for air and coughing violently, he grabbed Goliath's halter with shaking hands. The foals pressed even closer to the stallion, their small bodies quivering with terror. Some of them were crying out high-pitched whinnies that cut through the roar of the approaching fire. Jack looked at them, at their wide, frightened eyes and trembling legs, and felt his heart break. They were so young, so vulnerable. Most of them barely reached his shoulder. How could he possibly get them all to safety? He turned to Goliath, and in that moment, man and horse seemed to communicate in a way that went beyond words. Jack saw something in the stallion's eyes that he had never seen before, a fierce protective instinct that was almost human in its intensity. Goliath was not going to leave these foals. He had made that decision already, had planted himself as their guardian, and nothing Jack could say or do would change his mind. The realization hit Jack like a physical blow. If he tried to lead Goliath away, the foals would scatter in panic. And if the foals scattered, they would die. It was that simple, that terrible. Jack's training, his decades of experience with horses, told him what he had to do. He needed to trust Goliath. The stallion had already shown more sense than Jack himself, keeping the foals together when every instinct should have told them to run. Horses were flight animals designed by nature to scatter and flee from danger, but Goliath had overridden that instinct, had used his size and presence to keep the young ones calm and grouped. If there was any chance of getting them out alive, it would be by following the stallion's lead. Jack ran back to his truck and grabbed the rope he kept in the bed, along with the emergency fire blanket and the 2 bottles of water he had brought. His hands were steadier now, his mind clicking into that clear, focused state that came in true emergencies. He soaked the fire blanket in one of the water bottles, then tied the rope to Goliath's halter. The stallion stood perfectly still, allowing Jack to work, his attention never wavering from the foals pressed against his sides. The fire had reached the far end of the pasture now. Jack could see individual trees exploding into flames, could hear the terrible cracking sound of trunks splitting from the heat. The grass was burning, racing toward them in a line of orange and red that seemed alive, seemed hungry. They had minutes, maybe less. Jack looked up at Goliath, at this magnificent animal who should have fled hours ago but had chosen to stay, and he made a promise. Whatever happened next, whatever the fire brought, he would not leave them. If Goliath was willing to risk everything for these foals, then Jack would stand with him. He grabbed the stallion's mane with one hand and the rope with the other, and together they began to move. Not away from the fire, which would have been impossible now, but toward the creek. It was their only chance, the only place where the flames might not be able to reach them. Goliath moved slowly, carefully, making sure the foals stayed close. The young horses followed him instinctively, trusting the big stallion even as smoke and ash rained down around them. Jack walked beside Goliath's massive shoulder, guiding them toward water and whatever slim hope it offered, while behind them the world burned. The creek was perhaps 200 yards away, but it felt like miles. Every step was a battle against smoke and heat and the primal urge to simply run. Jack kept one hand on Goliath's powerful neck, feeling the muscles move beneath the coat, drawing strength from the stallion's unwavering determination. The foals stayed pressed close to Goliath's sides, their small hooves kicking up dust that mixed with the falling ash. A few of them stumbled, their legs not yet strong enough for this kind of sustained movement. But each time one faltered, Goliath would slow his pace, waiting until the youngster regained its footing before moving forward again. The sound of the fire was like nothing Jack had ever heard. It was not just crackling or roaring. It was a living, breathing thing that consumed the air itself. He could feel the oxygen being sucked away, could feel his lungs struggling to find anything clean to breathe. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and the heat was so intense that exposed skin on his arms felt like it was blistering. Still they moved forward, Goliath leading the way with a steadiness that defied the chaos around them. A burning branch fell from the sky, landing just feet in front of them. Several of the foals reared back in terror, their small bodies trying to break away from the group. But Goliath was there, his massive presence blocking their escape route, his deep, steady breathing somehow audible even over the fire. He nudged the frightened foals back into position with his nose, and they obeyed, their trust in him overriding their fear. Jack watched this unfold through stinging, watering eyes and felt something shift inside him. This was not just animal instinct. This was something deeper, something that spoke to a bond he had never fully understood despite a lifetime around horses. They were 50 yards from the creek when Jack realized they had a new problem. The fire had moved faster than he anticipated, sweeping around from the east and cutting off a direct path to the water. Flames danced along the creek bank on the far side, and thick smoke obscured what lay ahead. Jack's mind raced, calculating angles and distances, trying to find a way through. But every option he considered ended the same way, with them trapped between walls of fire with nowhere to go. Goliath stopped moving. The stallion stood perfectly still, his massive head raised high, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The foals huddled closer, sensing the hesitation in their protector. Jack looked up at Goliath's face and saw something remarkable. The horse was thinking, actually processing the situation before them. His ears swiveled forward and back, his eyes scanning the landscape, and Jack could almost see the gears turning behind those intelligent eyes. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, Goliath made a decision. The stallion turned sharply to the left, heading not toward the creek but toward a rocky outcropping that Jack knew marked the edge of an old cattle trail. It was a route Jack himself had forgotten about, one that wound along the base of the hillside and eventually curved back to meet the creek about a quarter-mile downstream. The path was narrow and treacherous, barely wide enough for the massive Percheron, and Jack had no idea if the foals could navigate it. But Goliath was already moving, and the young horses followed without question. Jack stumbled after them, his legs burning with exhaustion, his throat raw from smoke. The fire was on three sides of them now, a horseshoe of flames that was slowly closing. The heat was unbearable, and Jack could feel his hair singeing, could smell the acrid scent of burning fabric from his clothes. His vision was blurring. Whether from smoke or tears or pure exhaustion, he could not tell. But he kept moving, kept following the enormous dark shape of Goliath ahead of him, trusting the stallion in a way he had never trusted anything in his life. The cattle trail was even more dangerous than Jack remembered. Loose rocks skittered beneath their feet, and in several places the path narrowed to barely 2 feet wide with a steep drop-off on one side. Goliath moved with incredible care, placing each massive hoof deliberately, testing the ground before putting his full weight down. Behind him, the foals followed in single file, their natural agility helping them navigate obstacles that would have stopped adult horses. Jack brought up the rear, his heart in his throat every time one of the youngsters slipped or stumbled near the edge. They had been on the trail for perhaps 10 minutes when Jack heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a deep, rumbling roar, different from the fire, coming from somewhere above them. He looked up through the smoke and saw a sight from his nightmares. A flaming tree, massive and ancient, was falling directly toward them. It moved almost in slow motion, a giant fiery spear cutting through the smoke-filled air, and Jack knew with absolute certainty that they could not outrun it. But Goliath had already seen it. The stallion let out a sound Jack had never heard before, a deep, bellowing call that seemed to come from the very center of his being. The foals responded instantly, breaking into a panicked gallop along the narrow trail. Goliath held his ground for a precious few seconds, ensuring all the young ones were clear, before launching his own massive body forward. Jack ran too, his boots slipping on loose stone, his lungs screaming for air, as behind them the burning tree crashed to the ground with a force that shook the earth. The impact sent a shower of sparks and embers into the air, and Jack felt something hot slash across his back. He stumbled, nearly went down, but kept his feet and kept moving. Ahead of him, through the smoke and chaos, he could see Goliath still moving forward, the foals still following, none of them stopping despite the explosion of fire and debris behind them. They had survived somehow, impossibly, and Jack felt a surge of hope that was almost painful in its intensity. The trail finally began to descend, winding down through a series of switchbacks that brought them closer to the creek bed below. Jack could hear the water now, a blessed sound beneath the roar of the fire, and he felt his desperate hope grow stronger. The smoke was still thick, still choking, but the temperature seemed fractionally cooler as they lost elevation. Goliath pressed forward with renewed purpose, as if he too could sense that salvation was close at hand. But 3 of the smallest foals were struggling. Jack could see them falling behind, their legs shaking with exhaustion, their sides heaving as they fought for breath in the smoke-filled air. One of them, a tiny paint filly with a white blaze, stumbled and went down to her knees. Jack's heart seized as he watched her try to rise, fail, and collapse back onto the rocky trail. The other foals continued forward, following Goliath, but the little paint remained behind, too exhausted to go on. Without thinking, Jack ran to her. His own body was screaming in protest, every muscle burning, his lungs feeling like they were filled with ground glass. But he reached the filly and dropped to his knees beside her, his hands running over her small, trembling body. She was still breathing, still alive, but her eyes were glazed and unfocused. Jack looked ahead and saw that Goliath and the other foals had rounded a bend and disappeared from view. He was alone with this dying baby horse, surrounded by fire, and he had to make an impossible choice. He could leave her and try to catch up with the others. She was too heavy for him to carry far, and staying with her meant almost certain death for both of them. Or he could stay, could hold her as the fire took them both, could ensure that she did not die alone. Jack looked down at the filly, at her delicate face and the terror in her eyes, and knew he could not leave her. If these were his last moments on earth, at least he would spend them doing something that mattered. But then he heard it. Heavy hoofbeats coming back up the trail, moving fast despite the treacherous footing. Goliath appeared through the smoke like some mythical creature, his massive form seeming to grow larger as he approached. The stallion had realized one of his charges was missing and had come back for her. Jack watched in amazement as Goliath lowered his enormous head and gently nuzzled the fallen filly, making soft sounds deep in his throat. The little paint responded to his touch, her eyes focusing on the giant horse above her. Goliath positioned himself beside the filly and then did something Jack would never forget. The stallion carefully folded his front legs and lay down on the trail, his huge body creating a barrier between the filly and the advancing flames. He waited, perfectly still, until the little paint used his body as leverage to pull herself back to her feet. Her legs wobbled and nearly gave out again, but Goliath remained motionless until she found her balance. Only then did he rise, fluid and powerful despite his size, and Jack saw the stallion's intention written clearly in every line of his body. Goliath was not going to leave her behind. He was not going to abandon any of them. And if carrying her was what it took, he would find a way. The stallion positioned himself so that the filly could lean against his shoulder as they walked, using his body as a support. Then he looked at Jack with those intelligent eyes, and Jack understood. They were going to get them all out, or they were going to die trying, but they were going to do it together. The 3 of them moved down the trail, Goliath supporting the weakening filly, Jack bringing up the rear and sending up prayers to anyone who might be listening. The smoke was so thick now that Jack could barely see his own hands in front of his face. His sense of direction was gone, and if not for Goliath's dark shape ahead of him, he would have been completely lost. But the stallion never hesitated, never faltered, moving forward with absolute certainty, even when the world around them was nothing but smoke and flame and chaos. They rounded another switchback, and suddenly the smoke cleared just enough for Jack to see the creek below them. But more importantly, he saw the other foals. All 19 of them were standing in the shallow water, and Jack felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. Goliath had not just remembered one missing foal, he had made sure all the others reached safety before coming back for the straggler. The depth of intelligence and care that required was staggering. The final descent to the creek was steep and treacherous, but they made it. The moment Jack's boots hit the water, he felt the blessed coolness seep through the leather and soak his burning feet. The little paint filly stumbled into the creek and immediately lay down in the shallow water, too exhausted to care about anything except the relief from the heat. Jack wanted to do the same, wanted to collapse right there and let the water wash away the ash and smoke and terror. But there was no time for rest. The fire had reached the top of the ridge above them, and burning debris was raining down into the creek bed. The water offered some protection, but they were still dangerously exposed. Jack looked around desperately, trying to find somewhere safer, some shelter from the falling embers. His eyes landed on an overhanging rock formation about 50 yards downstream, where the creek had cut deep into the hillside over countless years. It was not much, but it was better than standing in the open. Goliath had already seen it. The stallion was moving the foals in that direction, herding them with practiced efficiency despite their exhaustion and fear. Jack waited after them, the water coming up to his knees, feeling the current pull at his legs. The foals moved like ghosts through the smoke-filled air, small dark shapes that appeared and disappeared as the wind shifted the haze. Jack counted them obsessively as they passed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, making sure none were left behind. 11, 12, 13, 14, his voice hoarse as he called encouragement, 18, 19, 20. They all made it to the overhang. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it offered blessed protection from the falling debris. The foals crowded together in the shallow water beneath the rocky shelter, their bodies pressed close for comfort. Goliath stood at the entrance, his massive body blocking the opening, creating one more barrier between his charges and the fire that raged all around them. Time lost all meaning under that rock overhang. Jack had no idea if they had been there for minutes or hours. All he knew was the roar of the fire above them, the heat that turned the air into something thick and suffocating, and the steady presence of Goliath standing guard at the entrance. The stallion had not moved from his position, had not shifted his weight or turned his head. He stood like a sentinel carved from stone, his massive body absorbing the heat and smoke that would otherwise reach the foals huddled behind him. Jack sat in the shallow water with his back against the cold rock wall, his body finally beginning to register the full extent of what it had been through. Burns covered his arms and the back of his neck. His lungs felt shredded from smoke inhalation, and exhaustion pulled at him with physical weight. But worse than the physical pain was the knowledge of what was happening to his ranch. Everything he had built over 4 decades was burning. The main barn, the house his grandfather had constructed with his own hands, the corrals and fences and equipment, all of it was being consumed by flames. Years of work, years of memories, reduced to ash in a matter of hours. But as he looked at the 20 foals pressed together in the water, their small bodies still trembling but alive, he knew that none of those material losses mattered. These lives mattered. The fact that Goliath had refused to abandon them mattered. Jack thought about all the times he had prided himself on understanding horses, on his ability to read their behavior and anticipate their needs. Yet Goliath had shown him something today that went beyond anything he had learned in a lifetime of ranching. The stallion had demonstrated a capacity for selfless protection that Jack had only seen in humans at their very best, and even then not often enough. One of the foals, a sorrel colt with a small star on his forehead, tried to move toward the entrance of their shelter. Perhaps he was curious, or perhaps the smoke was bothering him less than the others, and he wanted to see what lay beyond. But before he could take more than 2 steps, Goliath shifted his massive hindquarters, blocking the opening more completely. The movement was gentle but firm, and the colt got the message. He returned to the huddle of young horses without protest, accepting the stallion's authority without question. Jack found himself talking to Goliath, his voice barely above a whisper, not sure if the horse could even hear him over the fire, but needing to speak anyway. He told the stallion about the first time he had seen him at an auction in Colorado, how even among a field of impressive draft horses, Goliath had stood out. He talked about bringing him home, about the way the big horse had immediately established himself as a calm, steady presence in the barn. He shared memories of competitions won, of breeding seasons, and the fine offspring Goliath had sired, of quiet moments in the early morning when Jack would come to the barn and find the stallion watching the sunrise with what seemed like contentment. But mostly Jack talked about what he was witnessing right now, about the way Goliath had gathered the foals instead of fleeing, about his intelligence in finding the trail, about his courage in facing down falling trees and walls of flame, about the fact that he had come back for the little paint filly, that he had not left a single foal behind. Jack's voice cracked as he spoke, emotion overwhelming him, and he realized he was crying. The tears cut tracks through the ash on his face, and he did not bother to wipe them away. The fire raged on above them for what felt like an eternity. At times the heat became so intense that Jack was certain the rock overhang would not be enough, that they would all perish here in this small sanctuary. The foals cried out in distress, their small voices filled with fear and confusion. But each time they did, Goliath would turn his great head and make a deep rumbling sound in his chest, and somehow it calmed them. The young horses would quiet, would press closer together, would trust in the stallion who had kept them safe so far. Jack tried his cell phone multiple times, but there was no signal this deep in the canyon. He had no way of knowing what was happening in the rest of the valley, no way of reaching out to Miguel and Tommy to tell them he was alive. For all his ranch hands knew, Jack had perished in the flames, another victim of a fire that was probably making national news by now. He thought about the worry they must be feeling, about the guilt they would carry, thinking they should have stopped him from going after the foals. He hoped they would understand that he had made his choice freely, that he had no regrets about trying to save these lives. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Jack noticed a change. The roar of the fire was growing quieter, or perhaps more distant. The temperature, while still brutally hot, had stopped climbing. The smoke remained thick, but he could see slightly farther than before, could make out individual features of the foals rather than just dark shapes huddled together. He looked toward the entrance where Goliath stood and saw that the rain of burning embers had slowed to an occasional spark drifting past. Jack pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking with exhaustion, and waded toward the entrance. Goliath shifted slightly, allowing Jack to stand beside him and look out at what remained of the world. The sight that greeted him was apocalyptic. The landscape had been transformed into something alien and hostile. Every tree was either burning or reduced to a blackened skeleton. The grass was gone, replaced by ash and scorched earth. Smoke rose from the ground itself in dozens of places, and the sky had turned a sickly orange-gray that seemed to press down on the canyon like a physical weight. But the fire had moved on. The main body of the flames had swept past their position and was now raging farther down the valley, consuming everything in its path but leaving their small pocket of creek and stone untouched. They had survived, against all odds, through a combination of Goliath's intelligence and pure luck. They had survived. Jack leaned against the stallion's shoulder, his legs suddenly too weak to support his weight, and let out a sob that was equal parts relief and anguish. They stayed under the overhang for another hour, waiting for the smoke to thin enough that breathing would not be a constant battle. Jack used the time to check each of the foals for injuries, running his hands over small legs and bodies, looking for burns or cuts or signs of smoke damage to their lungs. Most of them were remarkably unscathed, protected by Goliath's body and the shelter of the rock. The little paint filly who had collapsed on the trail was weak but stable, lying in the shallow water with her eyes half closed. A few others had minor burns on their hindquarters where embers had landed, but nothing that appeared life-threatening. Goliath himself bore the worst of the damage. His back and sides were covered with small burns where falling debris had struck him while he stood guard at the entrance. His mane was singed in several places, the long hair blackened and brittle. When Jack ran his hands over the stallion's body, he could feel the horse flinch at certain spots, could see the pain in his eyes. But Goliath made no sound of complaint, did not pull away from Jack's examination. He stood patiently, allowing his human to assess the damage. his attention still focused on the foals behind him. Jack's own injuries were adding up now that the adrenaline was wearing off. The burn on his back that he had felt when the tree fell was worse than he had thought, and his hands were blistered from helping guide the foals over hot rocks. His throat felt like he had swallowed broken glass, and every breath sent sharp pains through his chest. But he was alive. They were all alive. And that was more than he had dared hope for when he first saw the wall of fire advancing across the ridge. The question now was how to get them out. The trail they had taken to reach the creek would be impassable, blocked by fallen trees and unstable ground. The fire had changed the landscape so completely that Jack was not even sure he could find the trail if he tried. Their only option was to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would eventually lead them to a road or a clearing where rescue vehicles could reach them. But the creek bed was rocky and treacherous, and the foals were exhausted. Some of them could barely stand, let alone navigate miles of difficult terrain. Jack made his decision. They would rest here until nightfall, when the temperature would drop and breathing would be easier. Then they would start moving, taking advantage of the cooler air and the fact that any remaining hot spots would be more visible in the darkness. It meant spending several more hours in this burned hellscape, but it was better than pushing the foals beyond their limits and losing some of them to exhaustion or injury. He communicated his plan to Goliath, speaking to the stallion in a low, steady voice, not sure how much the horse could understand, but needing to say it anyway. To his amazement, Goliath seemed to grasp the concept. The stallion settled himself more comfortably at the entrance of the overhang, his massive body creating a living wall between the foals and the outside world. His message was clear. He would stand watch while they rested, and when it was time to move, he would lead them out. As the afternoon wore on, Jack dozed fitfully, his body demanding rest even as his mind refused to fully shut down. Every sound jerked him awake. Every shift in the wind made him tense, expecting the fire to return. The foals slept piled together like puppies, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. Even in sleep, they sought the comfort of contact, of knowing they were not alone. Jack watched them and felt something shift in his understanding of herd animals, of the bonds that held them together. This was not just instinct. This was something deeper, a social structure and emotional life that rivaled anything humans created. When he woke from one of his brief naps, Jack found that Goliath had moved. The stallion was no longer guarding the entrance, but had instead positioned himself among the sleeping foals. His great body was curved protectively around the little paint filly, sharing his warmth with her, and several other foals had pressed themselves against his sides. Goliath's head was lowered, his nose nearly touching the paint's small face, and Jack could see his sides moving with each deep breath. The stallion was exhausted, finally allowing himself to rest now that the immediate danger had passed. Jack felt his eyes fill with tears again as he watched this scene. Here was something pure and good in a world that had just tried to kill them all. Here was love and protection offered freely, without calculation or expectation of reward. Goliath had not saved these foals because someone had told him to, or because he would be praised for it later. He had done it because they needed him, because he had the strength and courage to stand between them and death, and because leaving them was simply not in his nature. The rancher thought about all the years he had spent breeding horses, selecting for traits like speed and conformation and bloodlines. He had prided himself on producing quality animals, horses that would bring top dollar at auction or win ribbons at shows. But watching Goliath now, Jack realized that he had stumbled upon something far more valuable than any of those measurable qualities. This stallion possessed a character that could not be bred for or trained into an animal. It was simply who he was at his core, a protector and guardian whose courage came from love rather than lack of fear. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of red and purple, that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Jack began to prepare for their journey. He used water from the creek to wet his shirt, creating a makeshift filter for his mouth and nose. He checked each foal again, making sure none had developed new symptoms or injuries during their rest. And he had a quiet conversation with Goliath, explaining what they were about to attempt, asking the stallion to trust him one more time. When full darkness finally fell, Jack gave the signal. Goliath rose carefully, mindful of the sleeping foals around him, and moved to the entrance of their shelter. The young horses woke and followed, some more steadily than others, but all of them responding to the stallion's call. Jack took up his position at the rear, and together they stepped out of their sanctuary and into the scorched landscape, beginning the long walk toward home. The darkness was absolute in a way that Jack had never experienced. The smoke blocked out the stars and moon, leaving only the eerie orange glow of hot spots scattered across the landscape. These burning remnants provided just enough light to navigate by, casting strange shadows that made the familiar terrain look alien and threatening. The creek bed was their highway, a winding path through devastation that offered the surest footing in a world where everything solid had been transformed into ash and char. Goliath moved slowly, testing each step before committing his massive weight. The foals followed in a ragged line, their small hooves splashing through water that had turned warm from heated rocks. Jack brought up the rear, counting heads obsessively in the dim light, terrified that one would slip away into the darkness unnoticed. The little paint filly was struggling again, falling behind despite her obvious efforts to keep up. Jack moved to her side, using his body to help guide her, sometimes physically supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out completely. The journey was measured not in miles, but in small victories. Making it past a fallen tree that blocked half the creek, navigating around a boulder that had rolled down from above and now sat steaming in the water, getting all 20 foals across a deep pool where they had to swim, their small heads bobbing above the surface as they paddled desperately. Each obstacle overcome felt like a miracle, and Jack found himself offering silent prayers of gratitude to whatever force had brought them this far. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when Jack heard the sound. At first he thought it was his imagination, his oxygen-deprived brain manufacturing hope where none existed. But then he heard it again, distant but unmistakable. A helicopter. Rescue teams were searching the area looking for survivors, and they were close enough that their rotors cut through the constant background noise of settling ash and creaking trees. Jack looked up, trying to spot lights in the smoke-filled sky, but saw nothing. The chopper was nearby, but not overhead, probably following the main roads rather than this remote creek bed. Jack pulled out his cell phone, praying it still had battery, despite the heat and water it had been exposed to. The screen lit up, showing 2% charge and still no signal. But the phone had a flashlight function, and right now that was all he needed. He turned it on and began waving it above his head, sweeping it back and forth in the universal signal for distress. The light was pathetically small against the vast darkness, but it was something. It was hope made visible. Goliath had stopped moving, his ears pricked forward, listening to the helicopter. The stallion seemed to understand that this sound meant help, meant other humans who might take some of the burden from his massive shoulders. The foals crowded around him, some of them whinnying softly, their voices small and frightened in the darkness. Jack continued to wave his phone light, his arm burning with the effort, swinging it in wider and wider arcs. The helicopter sound began to fade, moving away from them, and Jack felt despair crash over him like a physical wave. They had been so close. Help had been right there, and he had failed to signal effectively. The phone's battery died then, the screen going black, taking away even that small source of light. Jack stood in the darkness holding a useless piece of technology and felt tears of frustration run down his face. They were alone again. Just 21 exhausted horses and one broken man, miles from anywhere safe. But Goliath had other ideas. The stallion raised his massive head and let out a sound that shook the canyon walls. It was not a normal horse call, not a whinny or neigh. It was something primal and powerful, a bellow that seemed to carry in it all the fear and exhaustion and determination of their ordeal. The sound rolled across the burned landscape, bouncing off rocks and hills, amplified by the empty spaces where trees had once stood. Again and again Goliath called out, his voice echoing through the darkness like some ancient signal fire, and miraculously, impossibly, the helicopter sound changed. It stopped fading and began to grow louder again. The pilot had heard something, had picked up Goliath's calls on their instruments, or simply heard it through the open door of the chopper. They were coming back, circling around, searching. Jack saw lights cutting through the smoke, brilliant white spotlights that turned night into day as they swept across the scarred earth. He waved his arms frantically, jumping up and down in the creek despite his exhausted body, and beside him Goliath continued his bellowing call. The spotlight found them. One moment they were in darkness, and the next they were bathed in brilliant white light that made Jack shield his eyes. He could see the foals clearly now, 20 small shapes pressed against Goliath's massive form, all of them looking up at the source of the light and sound with wide, frightened eyes. The helicopter descended until it was hovering perhaps 100 feet above them, the rotor wash sending water from the creek, flying and creating waves that knocked some of the smaller foals off their feet. A voice came through a loudspeaker, tinny and distorted, but the most beautiful sound Jack had ever heard. They had been spotted, help was coming, just stay where they were and hold on a little longer. The helicopter could not land in the creek bed, but ground units had been dispatched to their location. It would take time to reach them through the burned terrain, but rescue was on the way. The voice told Jack he had done well, that everyone at the evacuation center had been worried sick, that Miguel and Tommy were safe and waiting for news of him. Jack collapsed to his knees in the creek, the water soaking through his pants, and sobbed openly. They were going to make it, all of them. The long, terrible day was finally coming to an end, and they were going to survive. He looked up at Goliath, at this magnificent animal who had made it all possible, and saw the stallion watching the helicopter with what looked almost like satisfaction. The horse seemed to know that his job was nearly done, that soon there would be other humans to share the burden of protecting his charges. The foals, following Goliath's lead, began to settle despite the noise and light and commotion. They pressed close to their protector, trusting that if he was calm, then they could be calm too. And Goliath stood among them, his burned and battered body still radiating strength and steadiness, still the rock upon which these young lives depended. Jack watched this scene from his position in the water and knew that no matter what happened next, no matter what stories were told about this day, the truth would always be simple. Goliath had refused to leave them behind, and that refusal had saved them all. The ground rescue team took 45 minutes to reach them, 45 minutes that felt like hours as Jack and the horses waited in the creek bed under the watchful eye of the circling helicopter. During that time, Jack used his voice to keep the foals calm, talking to them constantly in the same low, steady tone he had used for decades to gentle, skittish horses. He told them about the ranch as it had been, about green pastures and warm stables, about sunny days and the simple joy of running free. He did not know if they understood his words, but they seemed to respond to his voice, to the promise of safety it carried. When the rescue team finally appeared, emerging from the smoke like ghosts in their reflective gear, Jack felt something inside him finally break. The adrenaline that had kept him moving for the past 12 hours drained away in an instant, leaving him shaking and weak. 2 paramedics rushed to his side, their hands gentle as they began assessing his injuries, but Jack waved them away. "Not yet," he told them. "The horses first. Make sure the horses were safe before anyone worried about him." The team leader was a woman named Sarah Chen, a veterinarian with the state's Emergency Animal Response Unit. She took one look at Goliath and the 20 foals, and her professional composure cracked for just a moment, her eyes widening with disbelief. "How did you get them all out?" she asked Jack, her voice filled with awe. "How is this even possible?" Jack looked at Goliath, at the stallion standing guard over his charges even now, even with help finally arrived, and he simply said the horse did it. He refused to leave them behind. Sarah and her team went to work immediately, examining each foal with practiced efficiency, calling out their findings to a colleague who documented everything. Minor smoke inhalation, some superficial burns, severe exhaustion, but all of them alive and likely to make full recoveries. "It was," Sarah said quietly, "nothing short of miraculous." Foals this young should not have survived what they had been through. The stress alone should have killed at least some of them. But here they were, all 20 accounted for, all still breathing. When Sarah reached Goliath, she spent long minutes examining his injuries, her hands moving carefully over his burned back and singed mane. The stallion stood perfectly still for her inspection, though Jack could see him flinch when she touched certain spots. Sarah's expression grew more concerned with each injury she documented, and finally she turned to Jack with a question in her eyes. "The burns were serious," she explained. "Not life-threatening, but painful, and requiring extensive treatment. They would need to sedate Goliath for transport, make him more comfortable for the journey out." But Jack knew, even before Sarah finished speaking, that sedating Goliath was not an option. The foals had come to depend on the stallion's presence, had learned to trust his calm steadiness in a world gone mad. If they sedated him, if he suddenly collapsed before their eyes, it would terrify the young horses and undo all the good that Goliath's protection had accomplished. Jack explained this to Sarah, and after a moment of consideration, she nodded her agreement. They would do this the hard way, keeping Goliath conscious and mobile, letting him lead his charges out one final time. The evacuation was a slow, delicate process. The team had brought portable lights that turned the creek bed into something almost normal, almost safe. They strung them along the path they would take, creating a tunnel of illumination through the darkness. Water and food were offered to all the horses, though most were too exhausted to do more than drink. Medical supplies were distributed, burns were treated with sprays and ointments, and every animal received an injection of fluids and medications to help them through the next few hours. Jack finally allowed the paramedics to treat his own injuries while this was happening. They cleaned his burns, bandaged his hands, gave him oxygen that he breathed gratefully after hours of smoke-filled air. They wanted to evacuate him separately, to get him to a hospital where his injuries could be properly assessed, but Jack refused. He would walk out with the horses, or he would not walk out at all. The paramedics exchanged glances but did not argue. They had seen enough in their careers to recognize when a person had made up their mind about something fundamental. The journey out began just before midnight. Sarah and her team led the way, their flashlights and headlamps cutting through the darkness. Goliath followed, moving with visible pain now, but still refusing to show weakness before his charges. The 20 foals came next, walking in loose formation, some of them leaning on each other for support. Jack brought up the rear alongside 2 other rescue workers, his role now reduced to observer, as professionals took over the task of bringing everyone to safety. It felt strange to relinquish control, to trust others with something so important, but Jack was too exhausted to do anything else. They followed the creek for 2 miles before the terrain allowed them to climb out of the canyon. The path Sarah's team had scouted was steep but manageable, switchbacking up the hillside to where a fleet of horse trailers waited on what remained of a fire road. The foals struggled with the climb, their small legs trembling with effort, but Goliath remained with them every step of the way, sometimes using his body to block their descent when one started to slip backward, other times moving below them to provide something solid to brace against. Loading the foals into the trailers should have been chaos. Young horses, exhausted and frightened, being asked to enter small, dark spaces. But Goliath made it possible. Sarah had the idea to load the stallion first, to let the foals see their protector accepting the trailer as safe. It worked. Once Goliath was inside the first trailer, standing calmly despite his injuries, the foals followed without hesitation. They crowded in around him, pressing close, and Goliath stood perfectly still, allowing them to take comfort from his presence one more time. 20 horses in 3 trailers, doors secured, engines starting, beginning the slow, careful drive to the evacuation center where veterinary stations had been set up. Jack climbed into the cab of the lead truck, the one carrying Goliath and 8 of the foals, and pressed his face against the window so he could see into the trailer through the slats. Goliath's dark eye appeared in the gap, and for a long moment, man and horse simply looked at each other. No words were needed. Everything that mattered had already been said in the creek bed, in the fire, in those terrible hours when they had faced death together and somehow found a way through. The county fairgrounds had been transformed into an emergency animal shelter, with temporary stalls set up in every available building and portable corrals erected across the parking lots. Generators hummed in the darkness, powering lights and medical equipment, and the air was filled with the sounds of frightened animals and exhausted volunteers working through the night. When the trailers carrying Goliath and the foals arrived just after 2 in the morning, a small crowd gathered to see the horses everyone had been talking about. Word had spread through the evacuation center about the stallion who had saved 20 foals, and people wanted to witness this miracle for themselves. Miguel and Tommy were waiting at the entrance, their faces haggard with worry and lack of sleep. When Jack climbed down from the truck cab, both men rushed to him, their relief so profound that none of them could speak for a long moment. Miguel finally broke the silence, his voice thick with emotion, as he told Jack they had been certain he was dead, that when the fire cut off the canyon, there had been no hope. Tommy simply gripped Jack's shoulder hard enough to hurt, his eyes saying everything his voice could not. The veterinary team began unloading the foals immediately, moving them into a prepared area where examination tables and medical supplies waited. But when they opened the trailer containing Goliath, the stallion refused to move. He stood at the entrance, looking out at the unfamiliar surroundings, and would not take that first step down the ramp. Sarah tried coaxing him, offering food and water, but Goliath remained planted in place. It was only when they began moving the foals past him, letting him see each one being led to safety, that the stallion finally agreed to exit the trailer. Even then, Goliath would not go far. The vets had prepared a separate stall for him, away from the foals so they could treat his extensive burns without young horses getting underfoot. But Goliath had other plans. He pulled against the lead rope, fighting to stay close to the foals, becoming agitated when they tried to separate him from his charges. Sarah made a quick decision and had them set up a large pen where Goliath could be treated while remaining in sight of the young horses. It was unorthodox, but nothing about this situation was normal. Jack stood to the side, watching the organized chaos, feeling utterly useless as trained professionals did the work that needed doing. A paramedic appeared at his elbow and insisted, this time with no room for argument, that Jack needed to be examined properly. He was led to a medical tent where his burns were cleaned and dressed, where x-rays were taken of his smoke-damaged lungs, where IV fluids were started to combat dehydration and shock. Through it all, Jack kept asking about Goliath, needing to know how bad the stallion's injuries were, whether he would make a full recovery. It was nearly dawn when Sarah finally came to find Jack in the medical tent. She looked exhausted, her face smudged with ash and her hands covered in ointment from treating burns, but there was something else in her expression that Jack could not quite identify. She asked if she could speak with him privately, and the tone of her voice made Jack's stomach clench with sudden fear. Something was wrong. Something beyond the burns and smoke inhalation. and exhaustion. They walked to a quiet corner of the fairgrounds where picnic tables sat abandoned in the gray pre-dawn light. Sarah sat down heavily and gestured for Jack to join her, and for a long moment she just looked at him with an expression that seemed to hold both admiration and deep sadness. Finally she spoke, her voice gentle but direct. When they were examining Goliath, she said, they had found something unexpected. The stallion had a tumor, a large mass pressing against his spine that had likely been growing for months. The kind of tumor that caused constant pain, the kind that would have made every movement an agony. Jack felt the world tilt sideways. A tumor. Goliath had been in pain, serious pain, and Jack had never noticed. How had he missed it? What kind of horseman was he that he could not see when one of his animals was suffering? Sarah seemed to read his thoughts and quickly explained that this type of tumor often showed no external symptoms until it was quite advanced. Even experienced veterinarians might not catch it without specific testing, but the burns from the fire had required extensive examination, and they had found it. The mass was inoperable, she told him quietly. Too close to the spinal cord, too integrated with vital structures. At best, they might be able to manage the pain for a few months, but the prognosis was not good. Jack sat in stunned silence as the implications washed over him. Goliath had been dying, slowly, painfully dying, and in what were likely his final days of strength, he had chosen to stand between 20 helpless foals and a wildfire. He had refused to abandon them even when every step must have sent agony through his failing body. He had climbed treacherous trails, stood for hours in blazing heat, carried exhausted foals on his back, all while his own body was being consumed from within by disease. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, and Jack made no effort to hide them. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her own eyes wet. She told him that in 30 years of veterinary medicine, she had never seen anything like what Goliath had done. The courage it must have taken, the sheer force of will required to keep moving when his body was already failing, was beyond her comprehension. Goliath was not just a remarkable horse, she said. He was something extraordinary, something that reminded everyone who witnessed him that animals were capable of a kind of nobility that humans often aspired to but rarely achieved. Jack asked the question he was dreading, though he already knew the answer. How much time did Goliath have? Sarah's expression told him everything before she spoke. Days, maybe a week or two if they were fortunate. The exertion of yesterday had likely accelerated the tumor's effects. His body was shutting down, had probably been shutting down for weeks, held together only by the stallion's tremendous will. What he had done yesterday, protecting those foals through the fire, had very likely been his final act of strength. The sun was rising now, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of pink and gold. Jack could hear the fairgrounds coming to life around them, volunteers starting their morning routines, horses nickering for breakfast, the everyday sounds of life continuing despite everything that had been lost in the fire. And somewhere in that chaos, Goliath stood surrounded by the 20 foals he had refused to leave behind, his great body failing, but his spirit unbroken, giving everything he had left to ensure they would live. Jack spent every moment of the next 5 days at Goliath's side. He slept in the stall with the stallion, ate meals sitting on an overturned bucket, and left only when absolutely necessary. The veterinary team had set up Goliath's pen so the foals could visit throughout the day, and they came constantly, pressing their small noses against the stallion's neck, standing quietly beside him as if keeping vigil. Goliath greeted each one with gentle patience, sometimes resting his great head on their backs, other times simply breathing in their scent like he was memorizing every detail. The little paint filly, the one Goliath had come back for on the trail, rarely left his side. She had claimed a spot against his shoulder and defended it against the other foals, her small body tucked against his massive one like she could somehow anchor him to life through sheer devotion. Goliath seemed to take special comfort from her presence, and Jack often found them sleeping side by side, the dying giant and the tiny survivor he had refused to abandon. Word of Goliath's story spread far beyond the evacuation center. News crews arrived wanting to film the heroic stallion and the foals he had saved. Social media exploded with the tale of the giant horse who refused to leave 20 babies behind in a wildfire. Offers poured in from across the country, people wanting to adopt the foals, donations to help with medical expenses, messages from strangers moved by an example of selfless love in a world that often felt dark and cruel. But Jack turned away most of the attention, wanting Goliath's final days to be peaceful rather than performative. Miguel and Tommy took turns sitting with Jack, keeping him company during the long hours, bringing him food he barely touched, and coffee he drank mechanically. They did not talk much. What was there to say that could encompass the magnitude of what they had witnessed? Instead, they simply bore witness, honoring Goliath's sacrifice with their presence, making sure the stallion knew he was loved and valued beyond measure. On the morning of the 6th day, Jack woke to find Goliath lying down, something the stallion had been increasingly reluctant to do as his condition worsened. The foals were gathered around him in a semicircle, quiet and still in a way that young horses never were. They seemed to understand that something was different this morning, that their protector was leaving them. The paint filly stood with her nose pressed against Goliath's face, and the stallion's breathing was shallow and labored. Jack knelt in the straw beside Goliath's head and placed his hand on the stallion's neck, feeling the heartbeat beneath his palm, strong once, but now irregular and fading. He spoke softly, telling Goliath everything he had never had the courage to say before, about how much the horse had meant to him over the years, about the hole that would be left when he was gone, about the impossibility of ever finding another animal like him. He thanked Goliath for teaching him what real courage looked like, for showing him that love and protection could exist without hope of reward or recognition. Sarah arrived with the veterinary team, and Jack knew without asking why they had come. Goliath's pain had grown too intense, his body too broken to continue. The kindest thing, the last gift they could give him, was to let him go peacefully rather than forcing him to suffer through more days of agony. Jack had known this moment was coming, had tried to prepare himself, but nothing could have readied him for the reality of saying goodbye. They gave Jack time, as much as he needed, to make his peace. He sat with his back against Goliath's side, feeling the rise and fall of the stallion's breathing, and he told stories. About the day they met, about competitions won and foals born, about quiet mornings in the barn when it was just the two of them and the promise of a new day. He talked about the fire, about watching Goliath refuse to leave the foals behind, about the moment he understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary. And finally he talked about what came next, about how all 20 foals would grow strong and healthy, about how Goliath's legacy would live on in them and in everyone who heard his story. When the time came, Jack held Goliath's head in his lap while Sarah administered the injection. The foals watched from their semicircle, quiet as church mice, their young eyes solemn. Goliath's breathing slowed, deepened, and then stopped. The great heart that had driven him through fire and pain and impossible courage finally rested. Jack felt the exact moment the stallion's spirit left, felt the absence of something vital that had animated this massive body, and he wept without shame. The fairgrounds fell silent in a way that seemed impossible for a place holding hundreds of animals and people. It was as if the world itself was pausing to mark the passing of something rare and precious. The foals approached one by one, touching their noses to Goliath's still form, saying their own goodbyes in the way horses do. The paint filly was last, and she stayed the longest, pressing her small face against the stallion who had carried her when she could not walk, who had stood between her and death without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, as the fire damage was assessed and rebuilding began, Jack learned the full extent of what he had lost. The ranch house was gone, the barns reduced to foundations, most of the pasture fencing destroyed. Insurance would cover some of it, but not all, and the road back to anything resembling normal operations would be long and difficult. Yet somehow, those losses felt manageable. They were just things, just structures that could be rebuilt with time and effort and money. What could never be rebuilt was Goliath. What could never be replaced was the lesson the stallion had taught in his final days about what mattered most. Jack found himself thinking differently about his life's work, about what it meant to breed and raise horses. It was not about producing champions or building a reputation or creating something of monetary value. It was about understanding that these animals had souls, had the capacity for love and sacrifice that rivaled anything humans could achieve. The 20 foals thrived under Jack's continued care, growing stronger each day, their burns healing into small scars that would always remind everyone of what they had survived. Jack kept them all, refusing every offer to buy them because they were Goliath's legacy and his responsibility. When they were old enough, he would train them with patience and kindness, would find them homes with people who understood their story and would treat them with the respect they deserved. And on quiet mornings when Jack walked among them in the temporary corrals they had set up on what remained of his land, he could almost feel Goliath's presence watching over them still. The little paint filly, whom Jack had named Hope, would sometimes stand at the fence looking toward the place where they had sheltered from the fire, and Jack wondered if she remembered the giant who had refused to leave her behind. He hoped she did. He hoped they all did. These 20 living reminders that love, true love, asks nothing and gives everything, even when the cost is everything you have left to give.